Well, I'm Elsie Smart from Rosebud near Melbourne, and I first met Barbara in August 1956. And it was a cold, wet night. We were at Essendon Airport, and everybody was excited. We just hadn't ever seen Barbara before, so we were all tensed up, and when he arrived, I was absolutely amazed at the feeling everyone had of love, and he embraced quite a lot of people, but I had this disappointed feeling because he didn't come over to me. But later on, we met him the next day, and we seemed to have relaxed, and everyone was overjoyed that now we could see Barbara, and he could be with us, because we'd been learning about him for so long that this was a great point in our lives. Actually, the most important point in my life was seeing Barbara, and he was just radiated some sort of love that you would never, or some special feeling that you've never ever experienced from anyone else in this life. So that the whole atmosphere was charged with some special joy, I should say. And I noticed when Barbara walked that he seemed to be almost floating, because he seemed to walk so quickly that you didn't seem to notice him moving, it just seemed to glide along. And everyone seemed to be very intense in trying to listen to everything that Barbara would say. Although he didn't speak, Erich translated all the beautiful movements of his hands and the expressions on his face, so that you didn't realise that Barbara actually wasn't speaking, but that you thought he was speaking. And this, all the things that he said seemed to, you forgot everything else in the world but just concentrating on being with Barbara. And I'm sure everyone, the first day that we had with Barbara remains in their life as the most wonderful thing that happened to them. One of the other things that I will never forget was when Barbara was with the children, all the children sitting on the floor around him. It was the most wonderful experience. And those little children seemed to know that Barbara loved them, and they were so happy, and everyone else around too. And I let someone... And it was a cold, wet night. We were at Essendon Airport, and everybody was excited. We just hadn't ever seen Barbara before, so we were all tensed up, and when he arrived, I was absolutely amazed at the feeling everyone had of love, and he embraced quite a lot of people, but I had this disappointed feeling because he didn't come over to me. But later on, we met him the next day, and we seemed to have relaxed, and everyone was overjoyed that now we could see Barbara, and he could be with us, because we'd been learning about him for so long that this was a great point in our lives. Actually, the most important point in my life was seeing Barbara, and he was just radiated some sort of love that you would never, or some special feeling that you've never ever experienced from anyone else in this life. So that the whole atmosphere was charged with some special joy, I should say. And I noticed when Barbara walked that he seemed to be almost floating, because he seemed to walk so quickly that you didn't seem to notice him moving, it just seemed to glide along. And everyone seemed to be very intense in trying to listen to everything that Barbara would say, although he didn't speak. Erich translated all the beautiful movements of his hands and the expressions on his face, so that you didn't realise that Barbara actually wasn't speaking, but that you thought he was speaking. And this, all the things that he said seemed to, you forgot everything else in the world but just concentrating on being with Barbara. And I'm sure everyone, the first day that we had with Barbara remains in their life as the most wonderful thing that happened to them. One of the other things that I'll never forget was when Barbara was with the children, all the children sitting on the floor around him. It was the most wonderful experience. Those little children seemed to know that Barbara loved them, and they were so happy, and everyone else around too. Now let someone...
Gladys Hewitt. I'm at Elsie Smart's house in Rosebud in Melbourne, Australia. And I met Barbara the same time as... No, not quite the same time as Elsie did, because I'd met him before in Sydney. He went to Sydney before he came to Melbourne. And I was living in New South Wales then. So I'd come down to Sydney and met him there. And there was quite a lot of hubble-bubble going on, everyone dashing round, you know, getting things ready. And we were all very, very happy. I know we were all dashing around saying, Barbara's coming, Barbara's coming. I was singing in my heart. And then Barbara came. And he came down the path. And he was embracing people. And it was my turn to be embraced. And happy as I was, he put his arms around me and I started to howl like Billy-O. I just cried and cried, wet his shirt and everything. And that was that. Well, quite a few extraordinary things happened there. For instance, I didn't know, Barbara and his party and a lot of others were going down to Melbourne. And I didn't know that I could go. I thought, having seen Barbara once, that might be my issue. And but Francis Brabazon said to me, he said, have you booked your seat to Melbourne? And I said, no, I didn't know I could go. And he said, well, you better telephone at once and get a seat. He said, I don't think you'll get on the plane now anyway. They were going the next day. Well, I walked down to the near village. You know, Francis's house was right up on the hill. And I walked down to a phone, he didn't have a phone, and rang the airport. And they said, well, we've got one cancellation which you can have. So therefore, I was on the phone, I was on the plane with Barbara and his party and came down to Melbourne. Well, I had nowhere to stay, but Clarice Adams was up in Sydney, and she said, you can stay with us. So Clarice had left her family and come up to meet Barbara, and we all went down there, and of course her house was in an awful mess. It had been left with her husband and kids, and the house was in a mess, so we started putting the house in order. And I said, well, when Barbara arrives, I'll make myself scarce, because he's really coming to visit your family. and not me. And she said, no, you're one of the family. Anyway, it poured with rain. It was raining like Billy-o, and they were coming. The cars were coming. The grass was wet. There was, a whole lot of water on the grass. And I thought that
This one, right?
I thought that Baba would get his feet wet. When he got out of the car, he'd have to walk across this grass. And I said to Clarice, can I have a blanket or a rug or something to put down on the grass? And there was nothing but an old grey blanket. So I got that, and I was just putting it down on this grass where Baba was to walk, and he shook his head at me. He didn't speak, of course, but he shook his head at me. And I said, Baba, you'll get your feet wet. And he took me by my arm, and he practically lifted me from the ground. And he was across, I didn't see him walk on the wet grass. The next thing, he was up the front steps and on the doorstep and inside. And then there were quite a few people with him. And we sat around, and the children played to him, and they had a cake for him and drinks. And I got right at the back of the crowd. I thought, well, this isn't my party, I'll be out of this. Well, when Baba got up to leave, he walked across, and he didn't go out. He walked through this crowd of people to me, and he put his arms around me and gave me a special hug. He must have known, well, of course he knew. Of course I cried again, and that was it. And after that we went on. That was the day that he was going round from one place to another. He'd been to Elsie's place then, hadn't he? Mm-hmm. Yes, he went to your place.
To Box Hill.
Oh, was that after?
After.
Oh, he went
to Markham.
Oh, yes, we went after that. And then up to Eltham.
That's right.
Now, how about that for a little story? Mm. All right? I didn't tell you the main point of it. This point of Baba floating, as I thought, across the grass, this very wet grass. It was about 2 inches deep in water. But when I looked at Baba's feet, he sat the other end of the room. When I looked at his feet, his sandals were dry. There was no water on his sandals. Baba didn't touch that grass. And how he got from the path in the garden up onto the dry steps, I will never know. So that's it.
Okay.
That's the miracle.
Bill Smart from Ringwood. Baba visited us one Saturday afternoon. The sun was shining at this stage. We came, but we'd already laid out.
Look this way.
We'd already laid out.
Look this way.
We'd already laid out a type of carpet matting for him to walk on, which when he left the car from the driveway, he walked along this matting and came to the front door, where he was greeted and embraced me and sister and mother. And then Baba asked me to show him round the house. So I showed him the different rooms, my own bedroom and the kitchen and the various rooms. And then before he left, he hugged us again, kissed us actually twice, and
Stroked your hand.
and stroked our hands. And then he left to Eltham, I think.
Did he say anything to you when he was there?
No, he just looked at the ceiling. He looked at different things in the room. He seemed pleased.
He made the sign like that.
He made the sign of perfection.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
I see. And he was happy.
Yes, he was happy.
And we had the lunch set out in the room, but he wouldn't stay to have any meal or anything. But in the sunroom where we had it was a nice room where Jean's, my daughter's bedroom, she was a nurse. That's where he made the sign of affection, you know, as he went around the house. And there was one incident. My daughter Jean was to have met Barbara down at Dennis O'Brien's that morning, but she was on duty at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and she couldn't get off duty, although I'd asked her to get off duty to make a special point, because I said Barbara is the most perfect man in the world and is the king of all, just like Christ was. I said, you ought to make a very special effort to ask the matron to let you off. But Jean, I said, you'd make a big effort if you were going to a dance or something, maybe. I said, you ought to make an effort to see Barbara and get off early. Well, she hadn't made this really big effort, which I would have done, so that when she got to Dennis O'Brien's, she'd missed Barbara. The last of his session was over. It was after 11, and we all had to go back home. So poor Jean cried very much because she'd missed seeing Barbara at Dennis's in Camberwell. Well, the next chance to see him was at our home when he was visiting the home, she said. So I drove home then, and we prepared our house for Barbara, and that's when Jean she met Barbara then. And I think Barbara must have seen when he entered the room how disappointed Jean was that she'd missed him. So he gave her a very special hug and patted her on the head. And Jean burst into tears because she was so upset. She hadn't realised that she should have really made such an important special effort to see Barbara. But our home seemed to be full of Barbara's love, and I decorated the house out with pink camellias that a friend had given me, and I thought it looked rather nice. And it was a joy when Barbara left then and embraced us all. And after that, in that home, those flowers remained in that house alive for 3.5 weeks afterwards. And I always felt that that home had some special radiance or joy or something there, that everyone who walked into our house used to say that this house has a lovely feeling about it. And I always put it down because Barbara had walked through it and given it everything, charged everything with some special love. And I'm sure I'm right there. That anyone really who had ever met Barbara would know that there was just that something that you could never find in any other human being. So do you think that's right, Lee?
Sure.
Would you like to say something?
Yes, Elsie made mention before of the children. My children were all there, of course, and I was talking to my daughter yesterday, and she remembered Barbara throwing them each some lollies as they were sitting around on the floor round about him, and he also played marbles with them, which he, of course, was an adept. He never seemed to miss the marble he was firing for, but nobody else could ever hit it the way that he used it, for sure.
That's right. Yes, he played with the Adams children too. They had a model train. He went into the room and played with that. And the lolly throwing thing too. He'd always throw sweets coming down in the aircraft from Sydney to Melbourne. You'd suddenly, you'd be dozing off. Everyone was so tired after these days of sort of up at night and making sure that everything was all right for Barbara. And suddenly a sweet would appear, would be thrown from his end of the aircraft down onto your lap. He just didn't want us to go to sleep, that's all, in his presence. And we didn't really want to, but we were tired. Another thing he did up in Sydney, there was a friend of mine, and she'd always worked for other people, and she'd done a lot of housework, and so he gave her the special task of laundering his clothes. And so she washed his clothes and ironed his clothes, and she shared that with me. And I said, well, it's not the same. Barbara's asked you to do it. He hasn't asked me, but still, I'll take part in it. So between us, we ironed his clothes.
You must have liked that.
It was lovely. Yes, it was.
Who was
Yes.
it that he gave the job
Beryl.
to? I thought it was Beryl.
Yes, yes. And she deserved it.
Ah, yes.
Now, that was his first visit, wasn't it? That's when he stayed at the O'Brien's house.
You remember I made a cake for
Ah, yes.
the children?
Yes.
Oh, well, tell us.
Oh, the children are, while I think of it, can I tell you about the children? Up at, when he was up in Sydney, he'd be sitting there, you know, discoursing, and Erich interpreting, and suddenly the children were playing outside, and suddenly one of them would stop playing, which is so unusual with a child. If they're in a game, well, that's it. But they'd stop playing, they'd just come in and sit at his feet.
That is amazing.
That is most amazing, yes.
Yes. Well, we made cakes when Barbara first came, and thinking that Barbara would like to have a nice cake. So when the children, we took them down to Dennis O'Brien's home and left them with Joan to look after. And when the children were all around Barbara sitting, he asked for one of the cakes. He knew there was a cake there. I don't think anyone told him. He said, I'll have one of those cakes. And he sent someone to get a cake. Well, they brought a cake in, and he said, no, take it away. Take it away. Not that one. I want the one on the top shelf. So they brought in the other cake, and he nodded and said, that's all right. And then he asked them to cut it. Erich, I think, cut it into all pieces and gave it to the children. Yeah. And I didn't know at the time, but didn't know later on, when I saw them cutting the cake, that it was my cake that he picked. So I can tell you I was very thrilled about it. So, yes, everyone always after that, used to say, Elsie's a cake maker. So if ever there was a cake for Barbara's birthday, I always had to make it.
Elsie made it every year.
And sometimes I used to make one of those cakes we'd have for Barbara's birthday. We'd keep a piece and we'd send it over to the Mandalay, and Money would let us know if she received it. One year it disappeared, they didn't get it, but most times they got it, and then she'd send a postcard and say. And one time we received a postcard to say that Barbara said your cake was delicious, and that was really one of the greatest thrills I had, to know that after all those years he really had tasted a piece of cake. Yes. That's right. So, well, that was 1956. And will we go on from 1958, Keel Mountain? Yeah. Well, of course, as you realise, having met Barbara in 1956, we were very keyed up to meet him again. But when we got to Woombai on Keel Mountain, everyone was very tense, of course, before he arrived, because they'd all been working so hard. But when he did arrive, of course, after the first meeting, it was a very tense meeting, and a lot of questions and a lot of things were asked and answered, and
What was it?
it was the discourse was on obedience, you see, and Barbara asked us, would we be able to obey, and we had to say whether we would be able to obey him. And some of the things he asked could you obey if you had to cut off your wife's head? Well, that was a bit hard, and some people thought they couldn't. But anyway, most of them thought they could obey. If it was Barbara that said, there must be some very great reason for it. But there were 3 boys there, and Barbara, 2 of them said they couldn't. And one man came out and said that he thought Barbara, it was too cruel to ask those things. So Barbara asked him to come out in front, and the 2 boys too. And later on they had a great talk, and they finally said they could obey him. Do you remember that?
I wasn't there. No.
Oh, you weren't there?
I wasn't
No.
there.
Anyway, everyone was very stirred up and very emotional at that meeting. But later on, it all worked out, and they all went outside and had a talk about it, and they decided they could obey Barbara, knowing that he probably wouldn't ask them to do something terrible anyway.
I wasn't there, but I had a message from him.
Yes.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, with the Advertiser Bird meeting, I'd gone over to Western Australia to nurse a sick aunt, and I didn't know the time of the meeting. They hadn't let me know when Barbara would arrive.